Despite it being just 3 years ago, the 2022 MLB season almost feels like a different era of baseball. Of course, this was before the rule changes that made the game faster, more athletic, and more offensive-minded. Back in 2022, games were longer, strikeouts were at an all-time high, and batting averages, stymied by the shift, were also at a low. Baseball was at this turning point offensively where home runs were king, but without the juiced ball, they also happened less frequently, leading to league offense across the board being at a low. However, while the play on the field looked widely different than what it made today, we follow in large part the same schedule as we did in 2022, watching our All-Star festivities happen in Los Angeles, followed by a trade deadline a couple of weeks later. Just as it always is, the 2022 trade deadline was filled with blockbusters, surprises, and head-scratching moves. And now, with the power of hindsight, we can look back on these trades and mostly assess which team ended up getting the most from these trades, and which teams ended up with disappointing results. But before we get on to the video, could you guys please hit the like and subscribe button? Currently, only 3% of people who watch my videos are subscribed, so if y'all do, not only will help me grow my channel, but also would encourage me to create more videos like this one for you guys. Without further ado, let's get on to the video. And before we get on to the trades, I think it would be nice to lay out the context of the league before the trade deadline, before we actually get into the trades made during the trade deadline. In a lot of ways, it mirrors what it looks like today. As of August 1st, 2022, the day before the trade deadline, in the National League, the Dodgers, with an absolutely stacked roster and a lineup consisting of multiple All-Stars and a pitching rotation filled to the brim with productive players, were running away with the league's best record. Behind them in the National League West were the Padres, who had bounced back from last season's historic collapse to comfortably hold a playoff spot, even without Fernando Tatis Jr. Meanwhile, switching cross-country over to the NL East, the Mets and Braves were in an absolute battle for the division, with the Phillies precariously holding on to the last National League playoff spot within the toughest division in baseball. Lastly, in the Central, the Brewers, led by their duos of Corbin Burnes and Brandon Woodruff in the rotation, and Josh Hader and Devin Williams in the bullpen, had the Central crown at the moment. But they were being closely chased by the Cardinals, who were jockeying hard for both the division and wildcard, led by their two corner infielders in Paul Goldschmidt, who would end up winning the MVP award, and Nolan Arenado, who would end up finishing third. Meanwhile, in the American League, the Yankees were riding Aaron Judge's historic record-breaking season with the best record in the American League. However, the Houston Astros, fresh off of winning the pennant last year, were not far behind in terms of the overall standings. Yet, even with these two juggernauts pulling away from the other teams in the standings, the other 4 playoff spots for the American League would be an absolute bloodbath. The Blue Jays' young core, after missing the playoffs in 2021 despite posting a 91-win season, came back with a vengeance to hold a playoff spot. However, the entire American League East was excellent. The Rays were doing their thing, hovering just over 500 despite losing their young star shortstop and future face of the franchise. The Red Sox squandered in July to ruin a good start, but still had a 500 record. And even the Orioles, who had been awful for the last half-decade, pulled off their best stretch of the 2020s in July to put themselves over 500 going into the trade deadline. For some other teams in the American League jockeying for playoff spots, the Mariners, with a surprisingly potent offense this year led by Rookie of the Year Julio Rodriguez and an emerging core of pitchers, were definitely in it. And of course, there was also the Central, which was a mess, with the Twins holding a slight lead, but the Guardians and even the White Sox close behind. So, with many teams, especially in the American League, having a shot at a playoff spot, we were approaching an unprecedented buyer's market going into the trade deadline, as the extra wildcard spot just prompted so many teams to make trades for the present instead of the future. So, now with the context out of the way, let's get into the trades. And I would love to start with the San Diego Padres, who embodied this win-now mentality by pulling off one of the more aggressive trade deadlines in MLB history by a single team. And at the end of it all, suddenly looked like worthy adversaries to the mighty Dodgers. So, with one of the most aggressive trade deadlines of all time, did the Padres' aggressiveness pay off, or did they squander a very good chance to build for the future? Well, starting off in what was a puzzling move at the time between two teams in the playoff picture, the Padres would acquire 4-time All-Star Josh Hader from the Brewers for a package of 4 players in pitchers Tyler Rogers, Dinelson Lamet, and Robert Gasser, as well as outfielder Estuary Ruiz, who had blazing speed. For Brewers fans, trading their beloved longtime closer was like a gut punch, and although they could see the vision in that Devin Williams was the closer for the future, this trade was confusing to say the least, even more so when they released one of the main pieces in Lamet shortly after the trade deadline. However, for the Padres, this was a very exciting time to be a fan, as it truly felt that ownership was beginning to realize the potential that this exciting young core had to be a dominant force in the National League. However, even with the polar opposite fan reactions, I think it's safe to say that both teams can look back on this trade as a small win. For the Padres, Hader continued his struggles from his first half of 2022, but in the playoffs he pitched 5 1/3 scoreless with 10 strikeouts, and took that momentum into a dominant 2023 season before leaving in free agency. Meanwhile, for the Brewers, although Lamet was ultimately released and Rogers was merely okay in his lone season in 2022, the prospects acquired in Estuary Ruiz and Robert Gasser still have an impact on this team today. And what's more, Devin Williams ended up fitting in nicely as the team's closer as predicted. Estuary Ruiz saw his stock rise tremendously during the 2022 minor league season, and he was used as one of the main pieces in a 3-team trade to acquire William Contreras during the offseason, who's one of the main pieces on this team today. Meanwhile, Robert Gasser was a top prospect for them before requiring Tommy John surgery in July of 2024, and looks to soon return within a month or so. Looking back, although neither team got the idealized scenario, at the end of the day they both got, in a small part, what they wanted from the trade, which is enough to give them each a B for this deal. However, while the Brewers would make no real other consequential moves and end up missing the playoffs at the end, the Padres would continue to make moves even after acquiring their star closer. They would acquire one of the surprises in all of baseball in Brandon Drury to be a utility man, trading away 18-year-old Victor Acosta. With Drury playing decently in his half season in San Diego and Acosta now 21 in high A, this is a decent trade for both teams now. Additionally, in what in hindsight is a pretty funny trade, they would end up trading Quad A player Brent Rooker to the Royals for catching depth in Cam Gallagher, and also trade their longtime first baseman in Eric Hosmer plus 2 prospects for former first-rounder Jay Groom. Hosmer was okay for the Red Sox, and both of the prospects are now in the upper levels of the minor leagues, but by contrast, Groom has since struggled in his time in San Diego and was released after a 1-year suspension for gambling. However, the real reason why Hosmer was traded in the first place was more as collateral for the biggest trade of the trade deadline and potentially in league history. Honestly, it may deserve a video of its own, but I cannot talk about this trade deadline without discussing this one in huge detail. With the Nationals struggling since winning it all in 2019, and with their superstar Juan Soto nowhere near close to signing as an extension with them, Washington would, in an unprecedented move, trade their face of the franchise with 2 more years left on his deal for a package that makes the term King's Ransom sound like an understatement. For Juan Soto and Josh Bell, the Nationals would get Luke Voit, a power-hitting veteran bat, and 4 of the Padres' top 5 prospects in C.J. Abrams, who was a top 10 prospect going into the year, Robert Hassel III, a top 40 prospect, Mackenzie Gore, a top 70 prospect, and James Wood, a 6'5" power-hitting outfielder drafted last year in the 2nd round. This was a ton to give up, and everyone knew it, but still, everyone had the Padres as winners of this deal for getting a top 10 player in all of baseball. And while now, 3 years later, the two teams have predictably gone in 2 different directions, with the Padres as one of the better teams in all of baseball since the Soto trade and the Nationals as one of the worst, it would be overgeneralizing to say it was all just because of Juan Soto. For the Nationals, one could definitely argue that they'd somehow be in a much worse position had they kept Soto. In the 3 years since the trade, the prospects acquired in this deal have turned out to be cornerstones for the club. C.J. Abrams, initially thought of to be a scrappy, contact-first infielder, has turned into one of the better power speed guys in the entire league. Similarly, Mackenzie Gore has turned into an ace for the ball club, racking out elite strikeout numbers, and Robert Hassel III just made his major league debut this year. However, what would end up being the best piece in this trade was ironically the afterthought during the trade itself, as the most lowly touted prospect in the deal at the time in James Wood, raked throughout the minor leagues to become one of the top prospects in the game, and now, at just 22 years old, looks to be one of the top players in all of baseball, and a new face of the franchise for Washington. The wins haven't followed the Nationals along with the production of these players acquired in the trade, but you can hardly say it's because of them, and if you had to trade a superstar, this trade is the model of what you should get back in return. Meanwhile, for the Padres, it was a bit more complicated than just getting Juan Soto. For the rest of the 2022 season, Soto was okay but not groundbreaking, and in the playoffs, while he only hit .212 across San Diego's run, he hit 2 home runs in the NLCS, so there were some flashes of superstardom amidst the transition. Moving on, 2023 for the Padres was one of the most anticipated seasons in a long time, with Fernando Tatis Jr. coming back, along with a full season from Juan Soto and a dynamic infield of Machado, Bogarts, Ha-Seong Kim, and Cronenworth, and a rotation that looked stacked on paper. The Padres were not only supposed to challenge the Dodgers for NL West supremacy, but were among the favorites to win the whole thing. And unfortunately, while Soto posted an overall terrific season, finishing 6th in the MVP voting and gaining his 3rd All-Star and 3rd Silver Slugger, the Padres as a whole, while statistically great, only won 82 games and missed the playoffs by just 2 games. Going into the offseason, now with no playoffs and a record payroll only expected to increase, the Padres had to get rid of someone. And with everyone except Soto under contract for a long time, he was the odd man out, and was shipped to the Yankees alongside Trent Grisham for Michael King, Randy Vasquez, Johnny Brito, Drew Thorpe, and Kyle Higashioka, making it an unprecedented 2nd time a superstar was traded before he would hit free agency. And what's more, arguably for the Padres, this was the best thing that could happen to their franchise. Brito was a solid reliever before requiring elbow surgery that has taken him out for all of 2025, and Kyle Higashioka delivered a strong season before leaving in free agency. Drew Thorpe was one of the main pieces to acquire Dylan Cease. Randy Vasquez has emerged as a solid middle rotation arm in 2025, and most of all, Michael King throughout all of 2024 and when healthy in 2025 has been excellent as a full-time starter after being used mostly as a relief arm throughout his Yankee career. Looking at a 2024 team that made the playoffs and a 2025 team that is gearing up to do just that, the traces from the Soto deal are all around. And ultimately, while not in the way anyone expected, the Padres are in a better spot now because of a trade that they made 3 years prior. So, with all that context out of the way, that leads us to the question, what are the grades for this deal, and can we really say which team won the trade? For the Nationals, I said it earlier and I'll say it again, if you had to trade a superstar, this is the package you want. You could argue that the Nationals' lack of success since trading Soto means that they lost the trade, but really, I have no clue where they'd be without this current young core. And had they kept Soto, knowing what we know now, he most definitely would have left the team for nothing more than a comp pick in 2024, and the Nationals would be even worse off than where they are now. So for navigating a difficult situation and getting something out of what could have been nothing, the Nationals get a B+ for this deal. Meanwhile, for the Padres, it's hard to blame Soto for them missing the playoffs in 2023, and with the return package they got from the Yankees, they managed to turn what could have been a disaster into a great overall situation. However, while they ultimately have a great situation now, I can't help but wonder what this team could have been like had they kept all of these prospects or traded them individually for pieces that they need. And for that fact, the Padres get a B- for the Soto trade overall. However, the Padres weren't the only teams to make trades, and although they did receive the majority of the headlines following the trade deadline, a bunch of other very impactful moves were made too. At the time, the biggest move not featuring the Padres happened a couple days prior to the trade deadline, where the Cincinnati Reds, fresh off of one of the worst starts in franchise history, traded their ace with 1 more year left of control in his contract to the Seattle Mariners for a huge return, as Seattle would trade their top-ranked prospect in Noel V. Marte, their 3rd-ranked prospect in Edwin Arroyo, and their 5th-ranked prospect in Levi Stout. For the Reds, Marte and Arroyo were both in the lower levels of the minor leagues, but with some huge developmental upside, so it was going to take some time for them to ultimately pan out. Meanwhile, for the Mariners, Castillo has been every bit the workhorse that they traded for, as he would play a huge role in leading Seattle to their first playoffs in 20 seasons, and after signing a 5-year, $108 million contract after that season, has consistently thrown 30 starts or more since with an ERA in the mid to low 3s. For what would emerge in Seattle as a pitching factory, Luis Castillo has been one of the faces of that movement, making this trade grade an A for them. Meanwhile, for the Reds, losing their ace hurt, but they would have another young ace of their own coming up the pipeline in Hunter Green. And as for the return, while Stout would pitch 10 underwhelming innings and be released after the 2023 season, Marte and Arroyo are both still in the organization, with Arroyo as one of Cincinnati's top prospects as a 21-year-old in AA, and Marte as a 23-year-old starter in the major leagues after a frustrating stint of injuries and an 80-game PED suspension. It's still way too early to properly grade this return for the Reds, with their prospects being so young and all, but for now, Noelvi looks like a burgeoning young stud and Arroyo an eventual everyday player. So I'll give it a B- for now, but with the prospects, it does have the prospect to move up should the young players develop into something more. So now, with the blockbuster trades out of the way, let's begin to look at individual teams. Back during my trade deadline winners and losers video for 2022, I marked the Dodgers as losers because of their, in my opinion, lack of moves in the face of their division rival going all in. And now, 3 years later, that take turned out alright. During the trade deadline, they would be one of the quieter teams, and it has not aged well. Despite their stacked roster, they would lose to the Padres in 4 games in the NLDS. And while San Diego's biggest acquisition in Juan Soto played in every game, the Dodgers' biggest acquisition, Joey Gallo, was left off the playoff roster entirely. In fact, the only player acquired in the trade deadline who would end up being played in the postseason was reliever Chris Martin, who threw 2 scoreless innings after he was traded from the Cubs for Zach McKinstry, who is now an all-star, mind you. Additionally, McKinstry is not the only player the Dodgers may regret trading, as in a bullpen crunch, they would end up trading Garrett Clevenger, who has since turned into one of Tampa's better relievers since the trade, for a young outfielder who is now an indie ball. The only real trade in which you could argue that the Dodgers won was an interesting one at the time, in which a young depth starter in Mitch White and infield prospect Alex DeJesus were shipped off to the Blue Jays for a pair of prospects in Nick Frasso and Moises Brito. Mitch White would struggle in his time with Toronto heavily, so it seemed like the Dodgers traded him at the right time. Meanwhile, Nick Frasso is now one of the better prospects in the Dodgers organization now as upper minors pitching depth. Nonetheless though, for a team to win 111 games only to go out on a whimper in the playoffs like that was astonishing, and I think that the 2022 Dodgers could be a lesson to teams today about the urgency needed to act during the trade deadline, as even if you think your core is good enough to win it all, there are always ways to get better by being aggressive, and if you aren't getting better during the deadline, you're getting worse, as other teams are trading around you. However, in the American League, the top teams were definitely a bit more active, although maybe not always for the best. Starting in the American League East, the top-record Yankees would continue to not be shy in acquiring new players. They would get Harrison Bader for middle rotation starter Jordan Montgomery, and while Montgomery would flourish in St. Louis for the next year and a half before being traded himself, Bader would struggle in pinstripes and ultimately be released. Additionally, one of the biggest moves of the deadline was when the Yankees acquired pitchers Frankie Montas and Lou Trevino, who both had years of control after 2022, for a package of 4 of New York's top prospects in Ken Waldichuk, Luis Medina, J.P. Sears, and Cooper Bowman. For the Yankees, Montas would struggle in his half-season in 2022 with injuries and miss most of the 2023 season with a shoulder ailment. Meanwhile, Trevino would pitch great in 2022, but missed all of 2023 and 2024 with a litany of elbow injuries that included Tommy John. It wasn't the Yankees' fault, but they ended up getting almost zero production from the biggest trade of that year. Luckily for them, however, none of the prospects that the A's got ended up working out, so the Yankees weren't burned too badly from this deal. The only player of that quartet to play during the 2025 season is Sears, and even then, he's a low-end starter for the team. However, the next couple of trades would work out a little bit better for both teams. The Yankees would get Scott Effross from the Cubs for Hayden Wesneski. Effross pitched great in 2022, and after missing all of 2023 with injury, he has pitched sparingly in pinstripes for the next couple of seasons. While Wesneski made his debut for the Cubs and was a part of the trade that sent Kyle Tucker to Chicago. Additionally, they would also get Andrew Benintendi, who is posting some very good numbers in a contract year, for 3 prospects who have yet to make the major leagues. Meanwhile, Benintendi, while not posting the same godly numbers in New York, was still a solid outfielder and contributor for the ball club. However, unlike the Dodgers, who watched their division rival get better while making minimal additions during the deadline, the Blue Jays were very active. Outside of that Mitch White trade, they would acquire a veteran utility bat and longtime Royal Whit Merrifield for 2 prospects that had very minimal impact for Kansas City. Merrifield was solid in 2022 and an all-star in 2023, so it was a good trade. Additionally, they also acquired 2 relievers in Anthony Bass and Zach Pop for what was, at the time, a top 100 prospect in baseball and former first-rounder Jordan Groshans. Pop was below average in his time with Toronto, while Bass had a great first half season to help the Blue Jays ultimately make the playoffs, before struggling in 2023 and ultimately retiring. Meanwhile, Groshans has yet to arise as an everyday major leaguer, with only 61 career major league at-bats, although he is only 25 years old. So outside of the Mitch White trade, one could definitely argue that Toronto was one of the winners of the trade deadline. And moving off the AL East, the Minnesota Twins, who had that slight lead in the Central at the time, were also very aggressive. They would acquire breakout closer in Jorge Lopez and Michael Fulmer for bullpen help, as well as another starter from the Reds in the rotation in Tyler Mahle, trading away Spencer Steer, Steven Hazar, and Christian Encarnacion Strand in the Mahle trade, and 4 pitchers in Cade Povich, Juan Rojas, Yanner Cano, and Juan Nunez in the Lopez deal. Unfortunately, the Twins were one of the biggest losers of the trade deadline. Not only did Lopez and Mahle fail to post similar results in Minnesota that they did on their previous teams, but they also ended up trading multiple future talents including all-star Yanner Cano, top prospect turned back-end starter Cade Povich, outfielder Spencer Steer, and Christian Encarnacion Strand. With the Twins missing the playoffs with a losing record, this was a trade deadline to forget for this ball club. The last really active team in the American League was the Astros, who with a little bit of hindsight would win the whole thing this year, triumphing over the Phillies. And while I wish I could tell you that this was because of a masterful trade deadline that they would pull off last second, unfortunately, that just wasn't how it ended up turning out. Their big move at the time was acquiring longtime Oriole Trey Mancini as part of a 3-team trade which saw the Rays get Jose Siri and the Orioles get Seth Johnson and Chase McDermott. If I had to pick a winner from this complicated trade featuring multiple big leaguers, I would probably pick the Rays. Siri had a couple of solid seasons before he was traded to the Mets for Eric Orze this year, who has been excellent this season as a reliever for them. Meanwhile, the Orioles would get minimal impact, as Seth Johnson was used as a secondary piece in the Gregory Soto trade, and McDermott still in the club as pitching depth. Lastly, for the Astros, Mancini would struggle throughout the season, including going 1-for-21 in the playoff run. Unfortunately, the other big trade for the Astros wouldn't be that much better in hindsight either. Needing a catcher, the Astros would trade for Boston's Christian Vasquez, who was having a great season offensively. Vasquez would be mediocre in his second half of the season and go 4-for-17 with no home runs in the playoffs. However, the real kicker came in the return package. The Astros would trade a couple of lowly ranked prospects in Emmanuel Valdez and Wilyer Abreu, who have both turned into major leaguers, and Abreu now looks like one of the better young studs in all of baseball. For the Red Sox to get this for just a half season of Vasquez was one of the better trades Boston has made in the 2020s. And for the Astros, despite these two bad trades, they did get Will Smith from the Braves for Jake Odorizzi, which pretty much cemented the Astros World Series win already, as he was right in the middle of his run of 3 straight rings for 3 different teams. And of course, we can't make a trade deadline video without talking about the teams in the bloodbath that was the National League East at the time. All 3 teams geared up for the postseason in their own unique way, and while some moves ended up being wildly successful, others crashed and burned. Let's start with the Braves, who would end up winning the division. They would make a couple trades, but the only real one that would have any sort of big league dividends would be a trade with the Angels, acquiring Raisel Iglesias, who just signed a 4-year deal with them, for Jesse Chavez and prospect Tucker Davidson. We know how this package looks for the Angels. Chavez struggled and returned to Atlanta, while Davidson is now minor league pitching depth. However, for the Braves, they found their closer, as he would be excellent for the 2022 season as their setup man and flourished as their closer for the next 2 seasons, and although he has struggled this year, I'm sure the Braves would make this trade 10 out of 10 times again. Moving downwards, the Mets were one of the most active teams of this trade deadline. However, the players that they acquired combined for a total of 0 WAR, and that was with Daniel Vogelbach actually being a solid contributor for them. Lastly, to round out the East, the Phillies came into the deadline with a few holes in their pitching staff and lineup, and they solved all of them. 2 trades with the Angels would prove very fruitful. They would acquire Noah Syndergaard right before he was truly cooked for former number 1 overall pick Mickey Moniak and Javier Sanchez. Syndergaard would be a solid middle rotation starter and pitch 8 1/3 okay innings in the playoffs. Meanwhile, for the Phillies, Moniak would show flashes before struggling in 2023 and ultimately being released, and Sanchez was also released this season as well. The second trade, on the same day nonetheless, would see the Phillies acquiring Brandon Marsh and a 1-for-1 swap for top prospect Logan O'Hoppe. This is a clear win-win trade. O'Hoppe would have barely played for the Phillies with Real Muto back there, and the Angels had an outfield excess. So both dealt from a place of strength to cover an area of weakness, and ultimately are all the better for it. For the bullpen, they would acquire David Robertson from the Cubs for starter Ben Brown, who gave them exactly what they needed in another back-end arm. And for infield depth, they would acquire Edmundo Sosa for Jojo Romero, another win-win trade, as Sosa has been exactly what the Phillies wanted as a utility bat, and Jojo Romero has emerged as one of the better lefty relievers in the game. Looking at how the playoff picture ended up turning out, we can really see how the trade deadline influenced all of that. The Phillies' pieces ended up working out, causing their team to be so much deeper and for them to make a deep postseason run, while the Mets, who got basically nothing from their deals, and the Braves, who just made one substantial trade, got bounced in their first series. In my opinion, this just goes to show how important the trade deadline can be at influencing the postseason landscape, even if the moves aren't necessarily blockbuster moves. And lastly, before we get on to the conclusions and the real winners and losers of the trade deadline, I want to discuss one more active team, and that is the St. Louis Cardinals. Of course, with a little bit of foresight, we know that the Cardinals would eventually overtake the Brewers to win the NL Central crown. However, how much of that was because of the moves they made during the trade deadline? I already talked about a couple moves they already made, getting lefties Jojo Romero and Jordan Montgomery, and they both helped down the second half stretch. Romero threw 14 quality innings, and in 11 starts, Montgomery was crucial at rounding out their starting rotation. However, what was potentially an even better move was acquiring Jose Quintana, who would be the Cardinals' best pitcher over that final second half of the season, and Chris Stratton, a quality bullpen piece, in a trade with the Pirates. The Pirates would end up getting Johan Oviedo, who has showed glimpses of potential before a litany of injuries has taken him out for all of last year and this year, and Malcolm Nunez, who looks close to Major League ready. But still, this trade is a win for the Cardinals, who got basically the best you can ask for when trading for a rental starter and reliever of this caliber. So, with the majority of big trades from playoff teams covered, let's get into the winners and losers of this trade deadline, along with what it can teach us about teams dealing in 2025. For the winners, easy answers are the Cardinals, Phillies, and Nationals, and it can be argued that the Angels, Padres, and Red Sox are also winners as well. And for the losers, I think the Twins, Dodgers, Yankees, Mets, Brewers, and Astros all come to mind. But the Astros end up winning it all, so I don't think that they care. From revisiting the trade deadline, I see a couple of lessons and teaching moments. For starters, there were a bunch of trades in which, at the time, really big ticket prospects were on the move. And while some of them ended up panning out, many of them are still in the minor leagues today. It just goes to show that at the end of the day, they're still just prospects and won't always pan out. When a team has a legitimate shot at winning it all and has a chance to acquire a player that can help out the major league team right now, prospects shouldn't be hoarded like they are guaranteed to become future stars. Additionally, looking at the big picture, a successful trade deadline with meaningful additions can really raise the potential of a team both in the regular season and postseason, while a deadline with little to no meaningful additions or even subtractions can do the opposite, sinking a team in the playoffs or causing them to miss it entirely. It's not all the time. The Astros literally won it all while overcoming a poor deadline, but the trade deadline is definitely an impactful part of the MLB season. Well, thank you guys so much for watching. Remember, if you enjoyed, please like, share, and subscribe, and comment down below new video ideas. As you can see on the screen, a bunch of the trades that I didn't have time to talk about or they just didn't fit into the script of this video are on the board right now, as well as their grades. So thank you, future me, for editing all of those. I really have to give you a hand. Additionally, as I talked so all the trades can be on the board for a decent period of time, I would like to talk about how you guys are all free to post your own video ideas down in the comments down below, whether you'd like it to be about the trade deadline, maybe even about next year's draft or international signings, or just whatever you want, either projecting for the future or looking back at the present. I'm always happy to look into more video ideas. And without further ado, I will see you guys all in the next one. God bless.